It is June 1762. The Tsar of Russia, Peter III, flees from St. Petersburg to escape a coup. Finding a boat, he heads to Kotlin Island in the Neva Bay, hoping to find sanctuary, but as he approaches, he is informed that the garrison has sworn loyalty to the new regime. Upon returning to the mainland, he is forced to abdicate and thrown in prison, where he dies soon afterwards under suspicious circumstances. 3 months later, Russia's new ruler is crowned. However, it is not a man that has seized the throne, but a woman, the late Tsar Peter's own wife. Her name? Catherine the Great, the Iron Empress of Russia. The woman known to history as Catherine the Great of Russia was born as Sophie Augusta von Anhalt-Zerbst on the 2nd of May 1729 in the city of Stettin, on the coast of the Baltic Sea in the Pomerania region, which was then in the Kingdom of Prussia, but which lies in northern Poland today. Sophie's father was Christian August, Prince of Anhalt-Zerbst, a German nobleman who rose to prominence within Prussia as a military commander under its king Frederick II, or Frederick the Great, and who after a long military career was made a Knight of the Order of the Black Eagle, Prussia's highest chivalric order. He was ultimately promoted to the rank of General Field Marshal of the Prussian army in 1742. Sophie's mother, Johanna Elisabeth, was the daughter of Christian August of Holstein-Gottorp, who, in turn, was the youngest son of Christian Albert, Duke of Holstein-Gottorp, and his wife, the daughter of King Frederick III of Denmark, Princess Frederica Amalia. Joanna's brother, Adolf Frederick, was elected as King of Sweden in 1751, meaning that Sophie was related to some of Europe's most powerful royal families on her mother's side. Sophie was born into the noble elite of Prussian society, meaning that she was given the very best education from an early age under the tutelage of a French governess, although she later stated in reference to her youth that she could see nothing of interest or out of the ordinary in it. Despite her family's titles, lineage, and military background, Sophie's parents were of relatively modest means, and it was clear from a young age that they were seeking an advantageous marriage for Sophie in order to further the family's dynastic and economic interests. Meanwhile, in her childhood years, she was a precocious learner and also something of a flouter of social conventions. For instance, the woman who would become Catherine the Great has been described as having been something of a tomboy in her youth, at a time when such things were not in any way common for the daughters of aristocratic families. It was an early sign of the individualistic streak which would come to characterize her life and reign. Although she was born into a family of German aristocrats with ties to Sweden and Denmark, Sophie's life would be lived in Russia as Catherine the Great. Sophie was born 4 years after the death of Peter the Great, Tsar or Emperor of Russia. When he had come to the Russian throne in the late 17th century, Russia had still been an emerging power in Eastern Europe, one which had developed from the Duchy of Muscovy in the 16th century to dominate the lands from the White Sea south along the course of the Volga River to the Caspian Sea. It was, though, still something of a backwards power, rooted in the medieval past, with little by way of proto-industry and an archaic system of landholding and agriculture. It also had no access to the Baltic Sea, as Sweden still controlled the lands around what is now St. Petersburg, while it also had no access to the Black Sea in the south. The resulting lack of trade connections with Western and Central Europe meant that the ideas of the Renaissance, the scientific revolution, and the burgeoning Enlightenment had not penetrated Russia to anywhere near the same degree as other parts of Europe further to the west. Peter's reign had changed much of this. In the course of the Great Northern War, he had acquired access to the Baltic Sea at Sweden's expense and undertook the building of a great new capital on the shores of the Gulf of Finland, which he named St. Petersburg. He also initiated a major reform program whereby he sought to modernize Russia, undertaking lengthy tours of Western and Central Europe in person to discover new ideas to bring back to Russia to implement. While these measures had helped greatly to modernize Russia and earned Peter the epithet of Peter the Great, he had not left behind a male heir, and instability followed his death in 1725. 4 Tsars or Tsarinas came and went in 16 years thereafter, including Peter's second wife, Catherine I, who died in 1727, and his grandson from his first marriage, Peter II, who died at the age of 14 in 1730. The throne was then taken by Anna, the daughter of Peter the Great's half-brother Ivan V, until 1740, when Ivan V's last surviving great-grandchild, the infant Ivan VI, ascended to the Russian throne. Shortly afterwards, in 1741, he was deposed by Peter the Great's daughter, Elizabeth. Elizabeth finally provided some stability and would rule successfully for over 2 decades, down to 1762. However, she did not marry or produce a legitimate heir of any kind, and this would open the way for Sophie to become Catherine the Great, ruler of Russia, in due course, in quite a circuitous manner. It is also worth noting of this period that the decades following Peter the Great's reign had seen several Tsarinas ruling Russia, thus creating a strong precedent for female rule in a country which prior to Catherine I's succession in 1725 had never had a female monarch. As she grew older, it became evident to Empress Elizabeth that she would not marry and produce an heir of her own. Therefore, with much of the direct line of her father, Peter the Great, having largely died out, and in order to solve the impending succession issue, she decided that upon her death, the Russian throne would pass to her nephew, Charles Peter Ulrich of Schleswig-Holstein-Gottorp. He was the only surviving child of Elizabeth's elder sister Anna, from her marriage to Charles Frederick, Duke of Holstein-Gottorp. Anna had died in 1728 of a bacterial infection just 4 days after her son's birth. He was thus the only grandson of Peter the Great through her line. Another reason for Elizabeth choosing her nephew to succeed her was her fear of a coup that might attempt to restore the imprisoned former Tsar, Ivan VI, to the throne, whom she herself had deposed and since kept imprisoned over a period of many years. The prospect of Peter becoming Russia's new Tsar inevitably made him the most eligible bachelor in Eastern Europe, and it was this prospect, combined with both Sophie's and Peter's family connections within Prussia and Germany, that would eventually see her become his bride. As well as this, the marriage also had powerful backers within the Prussian state itself. Frederick the Great of Prussia, for instance, wanted to forge greater ties between Prussia and Russia against Austria, Prussia's great rival for dominance of Central Europe. However, these plans were in turn opposed by Elizabeth's Chancellor, Alexei Bestushov, who supported a pro-Austrian and anti-Prussian foreign policy. For Sophie, as a child growing up in Prussia in the 1730s and 1740s, she would have been largely oblivious to the political power games which surrounded her future marriage, particularly the potential marriage to Peter, the possible heir to the Russian Empire, after Elizabeth became Empress of Russia in 1741, when Sophie was just 12 years of age. Sophie had first met Peter when she was 10 and he was 11. At that juncture, he had just recently succeeded as Duke of Holstein-Gottorp following his father Charles Frederick's death in 1739. As such, the marriage prospect for her at this juncture was to a German duke. But later, the situation evolved for Sophie to potentially be marrying the heir to the Russian Empire. The initial meeting between the two was not exactly love at first sight. Sophie disliked her suitor's complexion and fondness for playing with toy soldiers. In time, she would grow to despise many other elements of his personality, notably his frivolous nature and his alcoholism. In 1742, at the age of 14, Peter relocated to Russia to begin his preparation to succeed his Aunt Elizabeth as ruler of Russia one day. There, she named him King of Finland for a brief time after Russia occupied large parts of that country during the Russo-Swedish War of 1741 to 1743. In 1744, Sophie, along with her mother, joined her future husband in Russia. Sophie quickly began absorbing Russian customs and evidently quickly became attached to her new home, as, within a matter of months, she became fluent in Russian and was well liked by Empress Elizabeth. Yet, despite evidently impressing the Russian court, illness almost cut Sophie's life short in 1744 from what she would later describe as an attack of pleurisy, or an inflammation of the lungs that nearly killed her. In the end, she made a full recovery, meaning that plans for her marriage to Peter were accelerated thereafter. In preparation for that event, Sophie was formally accepted into the Russian Orthodox Church on the 28th of June, 1744. As part of this, she adopted the name Ekaterina, the Russian version of Catherine, and was known by this name going forward. A year later, On the 21st of August 1745, at the age of 16, Catherine was finally married to Peter in the Russian capital, St. Petersburg. After the ceremony, Catherine and Peter made their home in the Russian royal residence of Oranienbaum, west of St. Petersburg. However, the couple's union proved to be an unhappy, distant one. The two disliked each other and both took lovers while living in separate apartments at opposite ends of the palace. Dislike would turn to hatred over the years, as Peter became increasingly unpopular within the royal residence, drilling his servants in the early hours of the morning and drunkenly bursting into Catherine's rooms late at night, leading her to state that he was an idiot and a good-for-nothing drunkard from Holstein. Despite their evident disdain for one another, Peter and Catherine's marriage resulted in children together over the coming years: a son, the future Emperor Paul I in 1754, and a daughter, Anna, in 1757, who died in infancy, though Peter suspected Anna was not his child. In the years that followed, Catherine would go on to parent two more children, Alexei, born in 1762, and Elizabeth, born in 1775, both of which were the fruits of relationships other than that with her husband. On Christmas Eve 1761, Empress Elizabeth suffered a massive stroke. She had been complaining of dizzy spells for some time, but had refused to take any of the medicine her physicians had prescribed her, and had even forbidden anyone to mention the word death in her presence. As a result, her health went into a rapid decline over the following weeks, and she ultimately passed away on the 5th of January 1762, aged just 52. This was the day that both Peter and Catherine had been waiting for, and soon afterwards Peter was crowned as Tsar Peter III, Emperor of Russia, whilst Catherine was given the title of Empress Consort, or Tsarina. They now moved from their marital home in Oranienbaum to the famous Winter Palace in St. Petersburg, but despite Peter's accession to the throne, he showed no desire to change his drunken, carousing ways or an inclination to become a more sober and mature ruler of the nation. Discontent towards the new emperor first manifested itself when Peter decided to support Prussia's Frederick the Great, who, despite previously trying to establish good relations with Russia under Elizabeth, had ultimately ended up at war with Russia as part of the 7 Years' War, a conflict in which an alliance led by Britain and Prussia was fighting one primarily consisting of France and Austria. Russia had been allied with France and Austria in the conflict until Elizabeth's death and had played an important role, even raiding Berlin, the Prussian capital, in October 1760. Peter almost immediately switched sides, allying with Britain and Prussia, a move which tipped the balance of power in Central and Eastern Europe in favour of Prussia against Austria. Ultimately, the British-Prussian-Russian alliance would emerge victorious from the conflict in 1763, with Austria failing to recover the province of Silesia from Prussia, a region it had lost 2 decades earlier, and the recapture of which had been the primary Austrian motivation in the war. Britain was the big winner, acquiring control of France's colonies in Canada and emerging as the dominant European colonial power in India. But the switch to aid Prussia had not been entirely popular at home in Russia, as Prussia was viewed as Russia's emerging rival in the Baltic Sea and Eastern Europe, and his actions immediately soured public perception of Peter as the new Tsar. Indeed, he would not live to see his decision to switch sides in the war bear fruit. At the same time that he was ending his alliance with France and Austria early in 1762, Peter sought to extend Russia's influence over the Danish territory of Schleswig in order to bring it under the umbrella of his neighbouring Duchy of Holstein-Gottorp, which he had been ruler of since 1739, though one who was largely absent in Russia. The Danes were greatly alarmed by his actions and threatened to annex the imperial free city of Hamburg in northern Germany in order to force the city's banks to give them loans in preparation for more sustained conflict with Holstein-Gottorp. Peter saw this as all the justification he required, and therefore dispatched 45,000 Russian troops towards northern Germany. But his plans in this regard were never realized. Already by the end of the spring of 1762, just a few short months into his reign, there was growing discontent about Peter's character and methods at court, and his management of Russia's foreign policy. Many of the malcontents were plotting with Catherine, a much abler and intelligent woman than her reviled husband, and someone who was viewed as a potential ruler in her own right given Russia's recent history of female monarchy. Peter seems to have been oblivious to the threat which was developing around him, and foolishly decided to leave St. Petersburg in July 1762, along with many of his German-born courtiers and relatives, for a short break at his old residence at Oranienbaum. Catherine stayed behind at the Winter Palace, and it was at this juncture that speculative talk of removing Peter coalesced into a concerted plot to do so. After Peter left the capital, Catherine and her allies won over the elite Izmailovsky regiment of the Russian army to their cause. She then left for the nearby Semyonovsky barracks, where Orthodox clergymen, many of whom were involved in the plot, was standing by to formally proclaim her as the sole ruler of the Russian Empire. Thus, shortly afterwards, Catherine, with the backing of many elements of the aristocracy, army, and church, formally assumed power and ordered her husband to be taken into captivity. Peter was finally taken prisoner on the 9th of July 1762 and quickly abdicated in an effort to save his own life. Thereafter, he was sent to the Robsha Palace outside of St. Petersburg, where, according to accounts, he was quietly murdered on the 17th of July 1762 by Grigory Orlov, the brother of Catherine's lover and favourite, Alexei Orlov, who had played a crucial role in the coup. It remains an issue of considerable debate to this day as to whether or not Catherine ordered the murder of her husband, or if Orlov acted on his own initiative. Catherine's accession was not met with joy from all sides. This was evident in 1764, when a plot was foiled to release Ivan VI, the young Tsar that Elizabeth had deposed and placed under house arrest all the way back in 1741 from captivity and place him on the throne. Having learned of the plot, Catherine had Ivan discreetly murdered. More broadly, Catherine's right to rule is still debated today. She was not a member of the Romanov imperial family. Instead, she had ascended to the throne by right of her marriage into the family, and she was essentially a German upstart who had overthrown her husband. As such, her right to rule was largely predicated on the idea that she was now serving as regent for her young son Paul, a child of her marriage to Peter, and thus a blood member of the Romanov dynasty. However, if this was the flimsy basis on which she ruled Russia, it was revealed to be a lie through two developments. Firstly, on the 22nd of September 1762, Catherine was formally crowned as Empress of Russia, being the first ruler of the country to be crowned with the Russian imperial crown, a decadent crown crafted using thousands of diamonds, covering gold and silver spherical lobes, and mounted with a large ruby under a diamond-encrusted Orthodox cross. It would not have been standard procedure for a regent to be crowned in their own right. Secondly, and more significantly still, even when Paul came of age in his late teens and early 20s in the 1770s, Catherine did not step aside in favour of her son as a regent normally would do. She reigned down to her death. Propaganda aside, Catherine had become Empress of Russia without having any substantial blood ties to the Romanov dynasty. Catherine would become a paragon of the concept of an enlightened absolutist monarch in the years that followed. This was intimately connected to the wider Enlightenment that was sweeping across Europe in the 18th century. The Enlightenment was an intellectual, social, and political movement, one which tried to apply the rationalism that had emerged as part of the scientific revolution of the 17th century to society more broadly. It was led by writers like Voltaire, Jean-Jacques Rousseau, John Locke, David Hume, Thomas Paine, and Immanuel Kant, who argued that societies should be structured and politics managed in a way which aimed to benefit the mass of people in a country and lead to social progress in the fields of scientific and humanist knowledge, technology, industry, and economics. Catherine was an extremely learned and intelligent ruler, and she would become a paragon of what was termed Enlightened absolutism, where a monarch of a country, be it a king, queen, emperor, or empress, held absolute monarchical power without having much recourse to any parliament, but used that absolute power in an enlightened way to further the goals of the Enlightenment. There were numerous enlightened absolutists in 18th century Europe, Peter the Great of Russia being one, half a century earlier, and Frederick the Great of Prussia being another, but many historians view Catherine as the preeminent example of a progressive ruler of this kind. After her coronation, Catherine set about the affairs of the Russian state and began to implement her intended program of reform and modernization. She was determined that her empire should be the equal of its European rivals, especially in terms of the strength of its economy, which in the mid-18th century was largely dependent on cheap, low-skilled peasant and serf labor. Serfdom had once been common across much of Europe, but by the time Catherine came to the throne in 1762, was long gone from countries like Britain and France, and had been on the decline in Central Europe. In an effort to create a more buoyant and industrious society, Catherine decided to supplement the unskilled Russian workforce by encouraging foreign migration eastwards, especially by German farmers, into the more fertile regions of her empire, particularly around the basin of the river Volga. These foreign farmers were proficient in more advanced agricultural methods and soon helped to increase agricultural output, especially in the cultivation of crops such as wheat, potatoes, sugar beet, and, somewhat surprisingly, tobacco, a crop which Peter the Great had initially introduced and which the production of boomed in Russia under Catherine. Livestock farming also flourished. The new efficiencies in turn enabled proto-industries such as carpentry and ironworking to grow more common in the lands of the Russian Empire. This policy soon paid Catherine dividends, as, during her reign, the Volga region became the agricultural center of the Russian economy. To aid this economic activity, Catherine's government introduced the use of printed paper money bills and the establishment of banks, innovations which had begun to appear in countries like England and the Dutch Republic as early as the late 16th century, and were designed to create financing for investment into farms and proto-industrial activity. Along with these economic reforms, Catherine instigated an overhaul of the Russian education system, which, like the other areas of her empire, lagged behind other European countries. To rectify this, the Empress established an education commission, which, during her reign, would transform the education of many of her subjects, providing education to many Russian people up to the age of 15. These reforms were overseen by Catherine's educational advisor, Ivan Betskoy, and included the setting up of special orphanages such as the Moscow Foundling Home and the Smolny Institute. The latter was a special school for girls, firstly of noble birth, and later female children from the growing Russian middle classes. Indeed, Catherine insisted that her younger subjects, be they girls or boys, should receive an education, and later in her reign, these educational reforms would also be rolled out across Russia. Estimates suggest that over 60,000 pupils passed through Catherine's state schools during her reign, which are said to have numbered in the region of 550 across Russia's many provinces. These schools were not like their modern contemporaries, as playtime was forbidden in favor of a curriculum based on the learning of mathematics, science, history, the Greek and Roman classics, philosophy, and other subjects of both a humanist and Enlightenment bent. There were certainly flaws to this system. Strict discipline, often involving corporal punishment, was maintained, rooms were drab and cold places, and the provincial schools often were poorly resourced. Many noble families simply refused to send their children to state schools, while others objected to the Western European-style curriculum, which was perceived as being un-Russian. Despite these problems, it is widely acknowledged that Catherine improved and enlarged the Russian school system, though she was against the idea of universal education and actively prevented schools being set up for the poorer peasant classes and serf families. The reforms that were closest to Catherine's heart were her now famous patronage of the arts and literature in Russia. She established the Hermitage Museum in St. Petersburg in 1764 to house a vast collection of paintings which included parts of the royal collection built up by Peter the Great and other Russian rulers, and also a large number of paintings which she had agents working on her behalf purchase in Germany in the first years of her reign. Today, the Hermitage is one of the largest and most visited museums in the world. Catherine also tried her hand at producing her own creative works, including fictional stories, her own extensive memoirs, as well as some comedic plays. Her work even earned the praise of some of Europe's most celebrated writers and philosophers, such as Voltaire, who Catherine exchanged correspondence with for nearly 15 years, and who gave her the title of the Star of the North in recognition of her enlightened rule. Though the two never met, the Empress grieved for Voltaire when he died in 1778, and later bought from his relatives a substantial proportion of his books and papers, some of which he had gathered as part of a project to write a history of Russia under Peter the Great, one which was never realized. These papers and books of Voltaire's are housed in the National Library of Russia today. Catherine, like many rulers in Eastern Europe, was wary of liberating the lower classes entirely and stopped short of abolishing or even drastically reforming the institution of serfdom, a form of medieval peasant tenure that tied serfs to the estate of a lord or landlord and considerably limited their freedoms. Instead, she gave Russia's serfs the right to lodge complaints with local governors against their landlords, which gave Russia's poorest some measure of protection and rights, although Catherine's real reasons for establishing a process of grievance is said to have been because she did not want to overburden the central government and courts with complaints from the localities. Catherine also gifted state-owned farms to nobles, meaning that their workforce then became serfs overnight. She even reversed a proclamation of Peter the Great that prevented the Orthodox Church from owning serfs. In time, this failure to reform serfdom and landholding in Russia would have serious consequences, as there was a large revolt of serfs across Russia between 1773 and 1775 against the increasingly punitive and strict rules the nobility were imposing on them. This rebellion is known today as Pugachev's Rebellion, after Yemelyan Pugachev, a former army officer who used widespread unrest in the early 1770s in the Russian countryside to set up an alternative government in the name of the late Tsar Peter III, which was located in the area between the Volga River and the Ural Mountains to the east. In an attempt to rally the support of the peasantry, Pugachev outlawed serfdom in the regions he claimed control of through military alliance with the serfs and the Cossacks of the region stretching from Ukraine east to the northern end of the Caspian Sea. This presented Catherine's government with a considerable problem. The rebellion was a major challenge to the imperial administration and the power of the nobility, as well as Catherine herself. However, this insurrection was not to last long. Late in 1774, an army of Catherine's under the command of General Johann von Michelsohn, a German commander in Russian employment, defeated Pugachev's main army at what was then known as Tsaritsyn, but which has since variously been called Stalingrad and Volgograd. Pugachev was subsequently taken to Moscow, where he was tried and executed in January 1775. The last of the peasant unrest was crushed in the months that followed. Catherine is well known today for her liberal personal life. She famously never remarried after deposing her husband and his murder shortly thereafter. Instead, she took numerous lovers during her reign, often seducing young and ambitious men at her court in St. Petersburg who were eager to earn her favor. It could even be said that the reason Catherine did not take a second husband was due to her wishing to maintain control over all state affairs, possible proof of which can also be found in the fact that she did not generally retain her numerous lovers for very long. Yet many of Catherine's lovers were rewarded with titles, land or pensions for life, and in return many of them would do favors for the Empress. The most prominent example of these was clearly Grigory Potemkin, a Russian courtier and general who became Catherine's lover early on in her reign after aiding her in overthrowing her husband and seizing control of Russia. Potemkin and Catherine would maintain a stop-start relationship over many years, and he became one of her leading ministers, military commanders, and confidants. Some even believe that Potemkin and Catherine married clandestinely, but there is no real evidence to support this, and it remains almost entirely speculative. What is more certain is that the Empress enjoyed the company of over 20 different men of varying ages and social standing during her reign, including both commoners and aristocrats, all of whom were rewarded with gifts of land, money, and offices, though to varying degrees. These included Alexander Dmitriev Mamonov, Nicholas Alexander Suk, Pyotr Zavadovsky, Prince Zubov, and Grigory Orlov. Catherine's second son, Alexei, is understood to have been fathered by Orlov, a lover who became so powerful for a few years at Catherine's court that some considered him to be an unofficial co-ruler with her. Perhaps the most famous and important lover Catherine took beyond Potemkin and Orlov was Stanisław Poniatowski, who, it is sometimes claimed, was the real father of Catherine's deceased daughter Anna. However, this is contested. Poniatowski had first come to know Catherine after visiting St. Petersburg as a diplomat back in the mid-1750s, long before she became ruler of the country. They were lovers thereafter, though infrequently, as Stanisław did not live in Russia. Catherine aided him to acquire election as the King of Poland and Grand Duke of Lithuania in 1764, a union which, as we will see shortly, was pivotal in the extension of Russia's territory in Eastern Europe at the expense of the Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth in years to come. What is certain is that the pleasures of the flesh were extremely important to Catherine, as she even collected erotic furniture and works of art that were used to decorate her palaces in St. Petersburg. It should be noted, though, that there was little that was unusual in any of this. Male monarchs all over Europe in the early modern era maintained a string of mistresses and often sired many illegitimate children. Charles II, King of England, Scotland and Ireland between 1660 and 1685, for example, had over half a dozen prominent mistresses and engaged in many casual affairs, from which he sired upwards of 24 children. He probably did not know exactly how many children he had. King Philip II, who ruled Spain and its empire for most of the second half of the 16th century, might have been a pious champion of Roman Catholicism on the international stage, but this did not prevent him from having a gallery of paintings at the Escorial Palace in Spain featuring nude women striking erotic poses. What was unusual about all of this in Catherine's case was that a female monarch was acting in such a libertine fashion, and that she had little reservations about letting her court and the rest of the world know about her many relationships and promiscuity. In this, as in so many other things, she was ahead of her time. Catherine's relationship with Stanisław Poniatowski took on a deeper significance in the early 1770s. By that time, he had been King of Poland and Grand Duke of Lithuania for several years. The Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth, which he ruled, had once been a great European power, stretching in the 16th century from the Baltic Sea south into Ukraine and towards the Balkans and the Black Sea, covering much of modern-day Lithuania, Latvia, Poland, Belarus, and Ukraine. It had begun to decline thereafter, and by the mid-18th century was something of the sick man of Europe. The central government had become weak, and powerful aristocrats were virtually independent of the central government in Poland itself. More pressingly, the Commonwealth was surrounded by 3 states that had become more powerful in the 17th and 18th centuries, while it was becoming weaker, specifically Prussia and Austria to the west and Russia to the east. Catherine's reign would see the gradual dismemberment of the Commonwealth and annexation of it by these 3 neighbouring powers through a series of agreements known as the Partitions of Poland. Catherine was a major driving force behind the Partitions of Poland. As early as 1768, she had begun to interfere in the internal politics of the country, a move which provoked a revolt in the east of the Commonwealth, known as the War of the Bar Confederation. When it ended in Russian victory in 1772, the first partition of Poland was initiated by Catherine in conjunction with Frederick the Great of Prussia and Maria Theresa and Joseph II, the co-rulers of Austria. It was also facilitated by King Stanislav, Catherine's former lover. It would be followed by a second partition in 1793 and a third partition in 1795, the last of which brought the Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth to an end and terminated any Polish state. Russia gained the most land from all of the partitions, acquiring vast territories approximating to about half of modern-day Ukraine, virtually all of Belarus, and parts of eastern Poland. It is a contradictory element of Catherine's rule that, despite her enlightened approach towards government, she revealed herself to be a naked imperialist when it came to crushing the Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth. It was not just in regions like Belarus, Poland, and Ukraine that Catherine expanded Russia's border. For 2 centuries prior to her accession, Russia had been expanding southwards, first down the course of the river Volga to the Caspian Sea, and then seeking to acquire lands on the shores of the Black Sea at the expense of the Ottoman Turks and their allies in the region, such as the Crimean Tatars. Catherine was determined to strengthen Russia's position here further and become a Black Sea power, even one that might expand into the Balkans, where fellow Orthodox Christians were living in greater numbers under Turkish rule. Her ambitions in this regard were aided by the fact that the Ottoman Empire, after 300 years of aggressive expansion, was a stagnating and declining power by the middle of the 18th century. With these ambitions in mind, Catherine had her diplomats agree a trade and commercial treaty with Great Britain in 1766. While this was not a formal military alliance, it did have the advantage of making other powers, notably Austria, wary of trying to block Russian aggression in the Black Sea to too great an extent, as governments in Vienna were becoming more alarmed by potential Russian expansion into the Balkans, a region which the Austrians viewed as their sphere of potential expansion. Catherine's reign would be characterized by intermittent conflicts with the Ottoman Empire and several semi-independent allies of the Turks in the Caucasus and other regions along Russia's southern border. But the most significant of these was unquestionably the Russo-Turkish War, which was entered into in 1768 after the agreement with the British had been reached. It would last down to 1774. This was the 6th Russo-Turkish War in all, 5 others having been fought as far back as the late 1560s. It was one of the most substantial of all the conflicts between the two nations. It began largely owing to tensions over Ottoman support for fractious Poles and Ukrainian Cossacks within the borders of the Russian Empire and along the border with the Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth, and Russian support for the small independent Georgian states of the Caucasus, Greek rebels within the Ottoman territories in the southern Balkans, and also Egyptian separatists in North Africa, anxious to break free of Ottoman rule. The border conflicts in Ukraine and the Caucasus spilled over into outright war in 1768. Much of the fighting focused in the regions of Azov, the Crimea, the Caucasus, and Ukraine on the northern side of the Black Sea, though from 1770 onwards, the Russians also opened up a naval front in the Mediterranean Sea for the first time in the country's history, bringing parts of the Baltic Fleet into the Mediterranean. It was at this juncture that the Russians began aiding their fellow Orthodox Christians in Greece. The Mediterranean expedition, led by Count Alexei Orlov, the alleged murderer of Tsar Peter III back in 1762 after the coup that had brought Catherine to power, was enormously successful, splitting the Ottomans' forces between the northern front and revolts among the Greeks and others in the Mediterranean. Owing to all of this, when the Treaty of Küçükçaynaşa was agreed in 1774, the Ottomans ceded most of their lands on the northern side of the Black Sea to the Russians, notably the region around southern Ukraine, while the Crimean Tatars became a Russian vassal in all but name. In the course of the 1780s, the Crimean Peninsula was then politically annexed into the Russian Empire. The Ottomans were also forced to make major concessions to respect the rights of Orthodox Christians within their empire and their religious allegiances to the heads of the Orthodox Church in Russia. All in all, the Sixth Russo-Turkish victory ended in a comprehensive victory for Russia, one which made it a Black Sea power and signalled the beginning of the decline of the Ottoman Empire as a major European power. Although she had previously converted to the Russian Orthodox faith, Catherine did not practice her religion with any great enthusiasm. Indeed, during her reign, she seized extensive amounts of church property and even sold the belongings of the country's clergy and monasteries to pay for her wars. Yet, on the other hand, she still protected the Orthodox religion by restricting and regulating the practice of other faiths, such as Roman Catholicism and Islam, and offered foreigners financial inducements to convert to the Orthodox faith upon immigrating to the country. However, Catherine's policies towards the Jewish people were entirely different from her policies towards other religions. There was only a tiny number of Jewish people in Russia at the beginning of her reign, but the Partitions of Poland and the acquisition of extensive Polish territory, where many of Europe's Jews had migrated to in late medieval times to escape persecution in Western and Central Europe, brought a very large Jewish population under Russian rule. Catherine allowed her new Jewish subjects to, effectively, live as separate entities within Russian society, independent of the Orthodox Church, in return for higher taxes, although Jews who converted were exempt from these taxes and also allowed to join the mercantile classes as free citizens. This was a relatively tolerant policy, and Catherine certainly cannot be accused of any form of extreme anti-Semitism. But it was an unpopular policy amongst Catherine's other subjects, and eventually, towards the end of her reign, she caved in to public opinion and imposed greater restrictions on Jewish economic activity. Although these measures would today be seen as anti-Semitic, the Jews in truth fared about as well under Catherine as Russia's other religions, as the Orthodox Church itself was heavily taxed during her reign. In short, the Russian Empire under Catherine the Great became more secular than ever before. However, any group, be it the church or the peasantry, which could potentially challenge her authority in any way was undermined, whereas the nobility and middle classes were protected, as Catherine depended on them for the majority of her tax income and preservation of the government. To Catherine, science offered her far more than religion ever could, and as such, she encouraged the immigration of as many scientists as possible to Russia. These included botanists, mathematicians, and astronomers, notably Anders Johann Lexell, who would, after moving to St. Petersburg and its state-funded Academy of Sciences, go on to make important contributions in the field of celestial mechanics and would, ultimately, have a comet named after him. He also played a major role in the development of the mathematical field of spherical trigonometry. As well as being a patron of the sciences and new learning, Catherine was also eager to incorporate the principles of the Enlightenment into Russia's system of governance. Thus, in 1766, she established a Grand Commission in Moscow, a city which retained much of its political, social, and economic importance, despite St. Petersburg having been made the capital by Peter the Great at the start of the 18th century. The commission was comprised of around 650 members, who in turn came from various levels of Russian society, including government officials, the nobility, and boyars, the burghers or middle classes, and lastly, leading members of the peasantry. The purpose of this new body was to identify issues or problems confronting Russian society and to find remedies to them. Yet, Catherine was no democrat of any kind, and to ensure that this prototype parliament did not overextend its remit, she also issued a list of instructions that the commission was to operate in adherence with the concepts of Enlightened absolutism. However, it soon became evident to many within the Russian nobility, as well as Catherine herself, that this body was in danger of introducing democratic government within Russia, meaning it was soon dissolved. Despite this failure, the Empress did undertake several governmental and legal reforms to the Russian state, including the strengthening of the apparatuses of provincial government and restricting the power of the nobility by issuing the Charter of Towns or Cities and the Charter of the Gentry in 1785. The latter pieces of legislation placed all people into 6 social groups in order to curtail the power of nobility by creating a new upper-middle class population. It was around this time that the prospect of war with the Ottoman Empire reared its head once again, as Russia's southern rival attempted to retake the territories it had lost to Catherine in 1774. The Seventh Russo-Turkish War lasted from 1787 to 1792. In the course of it, the Ottomans were ultimately defeated once again. It was this second conflict with the Turks that gave Catherine's cousin, King Gustav III of Sweden, the opportunity he had been seeking to attack his northern rival, as he was experiencing domestic discontent within Sweden at the time and decided to attack Russia along the Baltic coast in June of 1788 in order to bolster public opinion in Sweden to his rule. His ultimate goal was to attack St. Petersburg from Sweden's territory in Finland and force concessions from the Russian. But the Russian Baltic fleet was able to defeat the Swedes in the Battle of Hoogland on the 17th of July 1788, meaning that the Swedish king's plans for an invasion of Ingria were sidelined, as were any Russian hopes of advances after the later Battle of Svensksund in July of 1790, in which the Russians were in turn defeated themselves. This forced both sides to conclude a peace treaty in August 1790, in which they returned broadly to the situation which prevailed prior to the 2-year-long war. Spurred on by these successes, Catherine's final military endeavour would be her war on Persia, in what is now referred to as the Persian Expedition of 1796. Persia was the pre-modern name for Iran, a country where the Qajar dynasty had recently seized power and which ruled extensive territory in Central Asia and the Caucasus region in the 18th century. The conflict between Russia and Persia started after the Muslim kingdom under Aga Muhammad Khan Qajar had invaded Georgia in the Caucasus the year before. Catherine responded by ordering her forces to march against the Muslim power. Many people within Russia assumed this expedition would be led by the veteran commander Ivan Gudovich. However, Catherine instead chose the relatively young and inexperienced Count Valerian Zubov, the brother of her lover, Platon Zubov. He quickly pushed the Turks back into modern-day Iran. However, despite the success of Valerian and the high regard the Empress had for his brother, the Zubovs would soon be cast into disfavor when Catherine's son Paul came to the throne after her death. The expedition also did not result in territorial gains for Russia, simply an end to the Persian aggression. Catherine's views on Enlightened rule took something of a severe turn in the final years of her reign. This was strongly related to occurrences on the other side of Europe, in France. In the summer of 1789, following many years of fiscal, agrarian, and social crises, the French Estates General convened at the Royal Palace of Versailles outside Paris. Over the next weeks, King Louis XVI and his ministers lost complete control of the political situation, and, by the late summer, the French Revolution was fully underway. It began as a semi-moderate political revolution, one driven largely by minor aristocrats, lawyers, and other middle-class professionals who wanted to reform the country into a constitutional monarchy. Then, in the course of the early 1790s, it became more and more extreme, eventually resulting in 1792 in the abolishing of the monarchy and the creation of a French Republic, followed by the execution of the King and Queen. The Reign of Terror in which radical revolutionaries took over the government and initiated a wave of political violence against perceived counter-revolutionaries, murdering and imprisoning tens of thousands of French men and women, followed in 1793 and 1794. From Russia, Catherine looked on aghast at these developments, no doubt troubled at the manner in which the same ideals of the Enlightenment which she had long championed in Russia had spiraled into such bloodshed in France, and what she viewed as mob rule. Nonetheless, while she abhorred what was occurring on the other side of the continent, she did not join other nations like Britain, Austria, and Prussia, which went to war against the revolutionary government of France in the course of 1792 and 1793, arguing that Russia did not have anything to gain from a conflict which did not directly threaten its borders or interests. It did, though, dampen her reform program considerably at home in Russia in the last years of her reign. During the later stages of her reign, Catherine sought to form greater ties with the new Swedish king, Gustav IV Adolf. When he visited St. Petersburg in the autumn of 1796, Catherine attempted to arrange a marriage between Gustav and her granddaughter, Paul's daughter, Alexandra, whom she hoped would become the Queen of Sweden. Initially, all seemed to be going well, as a royal ball was arranged to be held on the 11th of September 1796. The engagement of 17-year-old Gustav and 13-year-old Alexandra was due to be announced at this. However, much to Catherine's displeasure, the Swedish king failed to attend the festivities and instead left for Stockholm, as he was aggrieved that his prospective bride would not convert to the Lutheran Protestant faith. Gustav, instead, went on to marry Frederica of Baden the following year, and any prospective alliance between Russia and Sweden, after many years of enmity between the two nations, was scuppered. Catherine's health was failing by the time the negotiations with the Swedish collapsed. Not long after, on the 16th of November 1796, Catherine awoke from a good night's sleep, but just after her breakfast collapsed from a severe stroke and was found unconscious on the floor of her chambers by her servants, barely alive. Shortly afterwards, the Empress was put to bed, and her attending doctor correctly diagnosed her as having suffered a stroke. Despite the best efforts of her physicians, Catherine subsequently fell into a coma and ultimately died the following evening, the 17th of November 1796, at the age of 67, in the Winter Palace of St. Petersburg. Over the coming days, an autopsy was carried out on the late Empress, which concluded that she had indeed died from a cerebral hemorrhage. However, despite this, various rumors arose regarding her demise, including one outrageous story which held that she met her end engaging in relations with a horse, when the harness, holding her equine companion in position above her, broke, crushing her under its weight. Another tall tale regarding Catherine's final moments even stated that she was assassinated by means of spring-loaded blades hidden in her toilet seat that had been activated when she sat down. Historians agree that all of these accounts are fanciful in the extreme. Ultimately, Catherine the Great was laid to rest wearing a silver brocade dress and a golden crown in the Peter and Paul Cathedral in St. Petersburg. Catherine's passing created something of an issue around the succession. Her relationship with her eldest son and the perceived heir for much of her reign, Paul, had become strained from as early as the mid-1780s, as he entered his 30s, having been born all the way back in 1754, relatively early on in her marriage to Peter. Accordingly, Catherine had taken Paul's sons, Alexander and Constantine, into her household in the 1780s and begun raising them as if they were her own sons. It became clear over time that she intended to make Alexander, the elder of the two, her heir. Therefore, it was broadly against Catherine's wishes that Paul claimed the throne anyway following the death of his mother, and it remains unclear to this day if he had her last will and testament destroyed in order to hide the fact that Alexander had been named as the heir. He also passed the Pauline laws in 1797, one of which established the principle of primogeniture firmly in law in Russia, which held that the eldest male son of the previous monarch would always succeed them. Paul's reign was short, only lasting until the spring of 1801, when he was assassinated in St. Petersburg as part of a plot amongst the Russian nobility at his unpopular reign. Consequently, less than 5 years after her own death, Catherine had her wish when her 23-year-old grandson ascended as Tsar Alexander I. Alexander's reign would last a quarter of a century and was quite a successful one, with Catherine's grandson pursuing much of the reform agenda Peter the Great and Catherine the Great had initiated across the 18th century. Under his leadership, Russia also played an absolutely pivotal role in the Napoleonic Wars and the defeat of France after Napoleon's ill-judged decision to invade Russia in 1812. With this, Russia's emergence as one of the great powers of Europe was firmly established. Catherine had done her work well. Catherine the Great was unquestionably a great ruler of Russia. Along with her forebear half a century earlier, her grandfather-in-law Peter the Great, she dragged Russia into the modern world, completing the modernization process that he had begun back in the 1690s and 1700s. Catherine's own reform program was very broad, from her work on expanding access to education and the rights of women and girls in Russia, to her efforts to alleviate the poverty of the Russian peasantry. In terms of the realpolitik of the age, she was also able to expand Russia's influence enormously to the west and south into Poland, Ukraine, and the Black Sea and Caucasus. While Peter the Great made Russia a Baltic power, Catherine made it a great European power and paved the way for Russia to be the only European power other than Britain that could resist French expansion during the age of Napoleon Bonaparte. And yet there was also a darker side to Catherine and her reign. She was a ruthless ruler, one who overthrew her own husband and ruled herself for over 3 decades with a very tenuous claim to the throne. She also had the former Tsar Ivan VI murdered early on in her reign simply for becoming an unwitting focal point of conspiracies. Furthermore, she played a central role in the partitions of Poland, and in doing so, oversaw the process whereby the Poles, Lithuanians, and other groups were robbed of their right of self-determination for over a century to come. Finally, she failed to go far enough in reforming Russian society, and it would not be until well over half a century after her own time that serfdom, a very backward social system, was done away with in Russia in 1861. Catherine was unquestionably a great ruler and an enlightened one, but she was far from perfect. What do you think of Catherine the Great? Was she a power-hungry usurper of the Russian throne who then expanded the Russian state at the expense of millions of people in Eastern Europe? Or should she be remembered as the enlightened monarch she has so often been presented as? Let us know in the comments section. And in the meantime, thank you very much for watching.